Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back to my channel, Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer with you guys. Going to talk about Saturn ingressing into Aquarius. And I'm sorry I can't see you today, but hopefully this audio will still be satisfying. I have a lot of information to share, more than I probably can actually in terms of time-wise. So I'm just going to try to address some questions that have come up for people, concerns, and just general inquiries as well. We are, as we all know, we are currently experiencing events in the world that are naturally producing a lot of anxiety for people, a lot of concern and a lot of uncertainty, which is completely understandable. I'm not here to give advice to people in terms of, medical and health situations and conditions. I'm not a GP, I'm not a doctor, but I would like to, make a couple of comments to start with, from the point of view of what's happening with this coronavirus. The first thing is that a virus is actually ruled by Pluto. So when you want to understand anything in life and in the world in terms of the astrological correlation, then every single thing in life has a correlation to the archetypes in one way or another. So when it comes to a virus, the correlation is with Pluto. And as we all know, we've had this Saturn-Pluto conjunction active for the last, 18 months. This journey really began with the ingress of Pluto into Capricorn in 2008, which has created a lot of different things in the world relative to the consensus conformity in structure relative to governments, relative to religions, and the breakdown of those forms and structures, hence Pluto in Capricorn. So the archetype Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, and the 10th house in the birth chart, all have obviously a similar vibration because they all correlate to the same thing, which is Saturn. And, Saturn essentially correlates to the consensus reality and the social, cultural norms and rules that are basically created around us. And it starts off on an individual level where we grow up, the home we grow up in, the family we grow up in, and then the society we grow up in, as in the country, the social rules, cultural rules, religious rules, norms, etc., and so forth. And so from a child, we begin to become conditioned from those levels relative to where we were born. And it is Saturn that defines those boundaries and that social conscious structure in our mind and in our life. Saturn absolutely is important and has its purpose and function in very healthy ways as well. So Saturn is not this bad guy, but it is the point in consciousness that can only go so far in terms of evolving, in terms of spiritualizing, in terms of individuating, and in terms of waking up. So Jeff Wolf-Green has a very interesting graph in his book Uranus, Freedom from the Known, which correlates to the 7 chakras in the body. And I just want to take a moment to explain this. If you think about the 7 chakras in the body, the root chakra, which is right at the base of the spine, he has a correlation there with 3 layers pertaining to the root chakra. Okay, and the layer at the core at the bottom is Pluto, which reflects the soul. That's the most inner, deepest core layer, which makes sense if it correlates to the soul. The second layer is Uranus. So the frequency of Uranus wraps around Pluto, as it were, which correlates to our own energy and frequency from the point of view of our authentic sense of self. And then the third layer, and these 3 layers are all contained at the base of the spine, right? The third layer is Saturn, which makes sense because Saturn is the body that correlates to boundaries. So Saturn acts as this protective layer which creates all these boundaries around us in order to protect us, in order to give form and structure, and in order to help us create our own sort of reality, as it were, and have a relationship to the reality before us. The problem with that is that if we, through the conditioned experiences from birth, let's say, and not only from this life, because we bring in a lot of conditioned layers and responses from previous lives, which are all maintained in that area of the root chakra around Saturn's bounds or boundaries, right? So the more Saturnian we live in, and what I mean by that is the more we relate to the consensus reality and abide by the structure of the consensus reality, the more we remain at that level, and that boundary point there becomes very hard and very thick, and we just sort of stay on that level, and it makes it more challenging to activate the layers beneath, which is Uranus and then of course Pluto. So it is through the transits of Pluto and Uranus where we would have, different opportunities in life to allow breakthroughs to happen, right? To come through that root chakra and break through the walls of Saturn, if you like, which begins to enable us to individuate into our own unique sense of self, of who we are becoming. Now, this is important because Saturn's ingress into Aquarius is going to have a lot to say about this process, or these energy centers contained within us. And I'll get to that when I get to Saturn in Aquarius. Just going back to the present moment. So I've got a chart up on the screen at the moment for the 14th of March, which is today for me in the Southern Hemisphere. Obviously, anybody else in the Southern Hemisphere. And we can see there's this build-up taking place of Mars in Capricorn, Pallas Athena in Capricorn, Jupiter in Capricorn, Pluto in Capricorn, and Saturn right at the last degree of Capricorn. And this, particularly this conjunction between Saturn and Pluto, in my view, correlates to the outbreak of this coronavirus. As I said, Pluto connects to viruses. Now, The other thing that we need to consider here as well, when Pluto and Saturn were exactly conjunct, which was earlier in January of this year, of 2020, that was what would be called a new phase. So the conjunction it's a new phase conjunction, right, of two planetary bodies coming together, forming a new cycle of a new phase. Now, the thing about a conjunction in terms of a new phase, because a conjunction can be a balsamic phase as well, right? Which is a very different meaning. A balsamic is very difficult, actually, very challenging, but it also correlates to completion, endings, finishing things off, and so forth. A new phase conjunction is very, very interesting, extremely dynamic and extremely powerful. And as I mentioned previously in, I think it was in a video or something I posted, I can't quite remember now. One thing about a new phase and a conjunction is that it contains all possibilities. So for that reason, it's incredibly uncertain from the level of what is it going to mean? What is it actually going to create? In truth, we actually don't know. What we do know is that it's a new phase, a new birth of a cycle that begins between Saturn and Pluto. So what that's going to eventuate into, we really don't know. We just have to wait and see, more or less. But it is a marking of new beginnings relative to the energy of Saturn and Pluto. New challenges, new strengths, new possibilities. A conjunction can manifest in so many given ways. It can act as a square, it can act as a conjunction, it can act as a trine, it can act as an opposition. It's got all possibilities contained within it, which is the reason why we don't know exactly how this is going to manifest and assimilate into the collective. Okay, so I'm speaking more from the collective level. However, this also does apply on the individual level as well, relative to where this conjunction is transiting in your own birth chart. So that's one thing. On the other hand, we are also facing a point in history at the moment where Saturn is completing his journey in the sign of Capricorn. It's right at the end, as you can see on the screen. And that's clearly a very important cycle that's coming to an end relative to Saturn in Capricorn. So there's a couple of things about that. The first thing is that the last 3 years, everyone who has strong cardinal energy in their chart, meaning Capricorn, planets in Capricorn, planets in Cancer, planets in Aries, and planets in Libra, all those people that have, namely, particularly, personal planets in those signs, and even your ascendant, of course, as well, because that's an incredibly personal point in the chart, then those of you have had, the experience of Saturn either conjunct, opposite, or square your ascendant or any of your personal planets. And that has been a huge, intense, challenging period in your life the last 2.5, 3 years relative to Saturn and whatever planet Saturn was aspecting from the point of view of square, conjunction, and opposition, as I just said, which are considered the hard aspects. Hard as in, yes, you can say difficult, absolutely, without a doubt, but hard aspects in astrology doesn't mean hard as in difficult. It's just suggesting that it's a dynamic, a very intense dynamic aspect. So Saturn is now leaving the cardinal signs alone. So you guys are going to have a break, which you're probably thinking, well, thank goodness for that. Um, so when you are having Saturn, squaring, forming a conjunction or opposition to your personal planets or ascendant, depending on what age you are as well, obviously, and depending on just you, the person, the soul, your evolutionary journey, and just your relationship to yourself, your life, and the world, all those things are going to be important in terms of how you experienced this Saturn energy for the last 3 years. But if we can just point to some general themes, we would really be looking at things like restructure, new cycles beginning, reevaluation, revisiting, rebuilding, deconstructing. It depends on the aspect. If it's an opposition, then it's likely to be showing you um, a larger cycle that's actually been going on for the last 14 years, right? So let's just say, for instance, you had um, transiting Saturn opposite your sun. Well, 14 years ago, it was conjunct your sun. So the thing to consider from that level is, well, what was starting 14 years ago for you? What did you give birth to? What did you start in your life? What ideas and goals and things did you put in place that you were trying to set forth in your path? Well, at the opposition point, what happens is it's like you're standing in a point of crystallization, illumination, right? You can see what's happening in your life, what has grown, what has been cultivated relative to what you started 14 years ago. That's just one example. So when it comes to Saturn transits, it's always important to look at the larger cycle, right, of where Saturn first started relative to the planet it's transiting at the moment. And this process and this way of understanding Saturn is obviously going to apply to the next group of people, which is going to be all the fixed signs as soon as Saturn ingresses into Aquarius, which is, in about a week's time. It's on the 22nd of March. So all the Aquarians, Taurians, Scorpios, and Leos for the next 3 years are going to go through a very important process, developmental learning curve for the next 2.5, 3 years while Saturn is in the sign of Aquarius. And Saturn is not an easy archetype. It's not an easy time in life. It's where we have to get real. It's where we have to apply the work. Saturn also correlates to what's typically called karma. Now, whether you believe in karma or not is another issue altogether. But if you don't believe in karma, then you could just replace that word with the work that you have to do. That can be work that needs to be resolved from the past, and that can be work that is just important for where you are at the moment in your own developmental growth and process in your life. So Saturn is the work that we do, okay? The thing to understand about Saturn as well is that because it primarily correlates to the external reality, the consensus reality, okay, which correlates to the rules, the norms, the expectations, responsibility, and so on and so forth. The Saturn archetype is largely projected outside of us into the world. And on an individual level, we experience it from the point of feeling when you feel pressure from the outside world and the expectations that you feel from the outside world, from your external world, external life, that's Saturn. That's all coming from Saturn. So the ultimate growth and awakening is to reach a point in your path where you integrate Saturn 100% within you. And what that looks like is that you might still live in this reality, this consensus reality, and you're very well aware of the rules and norms and expectations, and the the rules that are enforced by the law relative to, you can't drive through a red light, for instance. It's one thing just being aware of these external constructed Saturnian rules, and it's another thing to feel at the mercy of it all and feel like you don't have any control or power over it. So what I'm saying is that the more you integrate the Saturn internally, the less you feel impacted by these external rules and norms. You're aware of them, but you don't feel the impact of them in a way that feels very personal. So the ultimate, the ultimate achievement with Saturn is to integrate it internally completely, which basically means being responsible for yourself. That's what it means. So true freedom, which correlates to Uranus, is having the ability to be totally responsible for your own self, your life, your actions, your feelings, everything, because then you're not projecting anything outside of you, feeling victimized or targeted or whatever it may be. Now, again, this is an important point, because when I start speaking about Saturn in Aquarius in a moment, you'll understand why this point that I just made is actually quite significant. Now, so Saturn is what you feel the world or society and others expect of you. And as you individuate and wake up, you realize that that level of existing or living, it's not the primary reality, for one, and you don't feel that pressure from that external world when you know how to work with that Saturn internally in the healthiest way, because Saturn is Saturn rules the largest organ in the body, which is the skin, right? That's why Saturn rules boundaries. And if you think about your own physical body, right, so if you look at your fingertips down to the end of your toes, it's skin all around, isn't it? And Saturn is what rules that barrier, right, as far as your physical body is concerned. And that's showing us that it's there, acting as a protective mechanism, right? I mean, we need to protect ourselves from a number of different things, and especially, in the times we're living right now with this virus thing going around, we're at a point where the things that we do in our life are extremely important in terms of protecting ourselves. Well, this is Saturn. Saturn is the energy, the archetype that's going to inform you of the things that you need to do to protect yourself. If Saturn wasn't there, we'd have no boundaries, and it would just be one big soup mix. So, Saturn is not all bad, is what I'm trying to say. Now, the interesting thing as well, and I know I am going to talk about Australia, and I apologise that I'm not bringing other historical things into the mix, but this only just occurred to me today. 30 years ago in Australia, 29 years ago, we had a recession. It was the first recession we ever had. Massive. So it was in the early 90s. And that was when Saturn was in Aquarius. And by the 22nd of March, we are going to experience Saturn moving into Aquarius. And a couple of days ago in the news here, they've announced that it looks like Australia is going to go into a massive recession, probably bigger than the one back in the 90s. So the reason I'm pointing that out is I know most of you don't live in Australia, and I appreciate that, but this is not about Australia. I'm just merely pointing to the astrology so that you can learn from this level as well, because what this is it's a Saturn return. That is that in the 90s when Saturn was in Aquarius and Australia went into recession, well, Saturn's just done a complete 29-year cycle, which is a Saturn return. And here we are again, back at a point where we are about to go into recession. So these are very important historical observations and correlations relative to large planetary cycles, in this case, the Saturn return. So this is more of a Saturn return pertaining to a country, in this case, Australia, and there would be obviously lots of other similar type of historical points, you know, relative to large planetary cycles and so forth. But I just found that very synchronistic, not coincidental, synchronistic. Now, I'm not going to speak about the different theories on the coronavirus in terms of where it originated. You know, there's lots of conspiracy theories on that. I'm not here to debate or argue that. Whilst I'm interested and curious about the different theories that are presented, I keep a very open mind because I feel that at the moment we don't quite know the truth. But what I do know is that a virus correlates to Pluto, and here we have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And Saturn about to ingress into Aquarius, which is showing us that groups of people are already affected around the world. So, for example, and I'm saying groups because Saturn is literally around the corner from stepping into Aquarius, and Aquarius correlates to groups, right? So we had an announcement yesterday where lots of social functions that involve having, you know, hundreds or thousands or a couple of hundred or whatever group type activities are all being cancelled here. So the Grand Prix, for example, which I know that most of you would know what the Grand Prix is, which is just a, you know, a racing car event. It's a very big event here in every March in Australia, in Melbourne actually, where I come from. That's been cancelled. The people's response to that is they're very angry. They're irate actually. They don't see the reason for it, and so on and so forth. And I'm pointing that out because very soon, and I'll get to that chart in a moment, what we're going to see is we're going to see Mars in the sign of Aquarius and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius. So they will be forming a conjunction. And we're going to have a conjunction between Mars and Saturn. Let me just show you that now, actually. Okay, so if I just, I'm just animating this chart day at a time, moving forward in time. So you can see Mars is building up through the sign of Capricorn. Now, this is a Saturn-Mars conjunction, even though Saturn's still, he's right at the end of, it's literally about to turn over to go into Aquarius, right? So the few days before this, we have this, even though Mars doesn't actually exactly catch up to Saturn, right? Because Saturn's going to move into Aquarius, it's still a conjunction, and it's a conjunction with Pluto and Saturn, and Jupiter, really. So we have this, powerful force here. I just want to go back though and just show you where the moon catches up. All right, you can see the moon's in Aquarius here on the 18th of March, right? So for a couple of days there, the moon's going to be, in Capricorn, I mean, and the moon is going to go over all these planets. And whilst that's only a transit for a couple of days, it's very significant because it's going to highlight and emphasize in a much more magnified way everything that's going on in the world relative to these planets here in the sign of Capricorn, and specifically, relative to the virus and further information. Sorry, I've got a really sore throat today. So the moon in astrology correlates to the people, to the masses, right? So what I think is going to happen when this moon reaches into the sign of Capricorn for a couple of days there's going to be a heightened sense, a magnified sense of the drama of what's going on. And that's not going to feel good, okay, because what's happening is not good. And it certainly doesn't feel good. So the moon, the moon's a light, right? It's the sun and the moon are the two lights, okay, the solar and lunar. So the two lights always light things up, literally, right? And the moon, as I said, correlates to the masses. The people on the planet are ruled by the moon. So the moon catching up to all these planets for a couple of days there is going to create a heightened sense of what I would think is probably a lot more fear, because we are talking about the archetype of Capricorn. And whilst on the one hand, a lot of that fear is unhealthy, because panic and fear compromises our health and our immune system, and therefore our overall well-being, right? So there's that side to it. But then on the other hand, the fear can also produce and promote right action for what otherwise would be a situation where people are just very carefree and not responsible, okay? So it has a double-edged sword, if you like, and it's really going to be up to each of us to not fall into the trap of allowing the Capricorn energy to completely suffocate you, right? Because that's what Capricorn can do when it's operating at the most fear-based level, which can be totally unrealistic, okay? It can produce this, like hypochondriacs, okay? Not that I'm making judgments, but there are people who are hypochondriacs, which is a Capricorn trait. So there can be this, mass hysteria that's sort of starting to spill out, okay? And I don't think that's healthy in and of itself. I think it's important to be realistic and to take precautions um, and to protect oneself and to try and be very, vigilant with health and nutrition and hygiene. I think that's highly crucial at the moment, but not at the cost of it um, producing this deep psychological fear and paranoia. That's not healthy. So this is what we're going to have to really watch in ourselves, and it's going to be extremely challenging because when we are when there's a wave that comes through into the world, it is extremely challenging to step outside of that and maintain objectivity and maintain the ability to see the bigger picture, because people get swept up in whatever is projected, all right, especially when it's the majority that's projecting it. So it's a minority of people that will not get swept up in it, but that will make the conscious effort to be um, cautious and responsible for their part in this, because we all have to be responsible with our own doing in this. It's, I mean, someone posted actually on my Facebook just a few days ago, a very wise person actually. It was a very interesting write up that he wrote. I can't remember it word for word, but in a nutshell, what it was that coronavirus does not distinguish between right or wrong, good or bad, black or white, spiritual, atheist, religious, atheist, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jew, Judaism, Jewish, and whatever other, philosophical or religious sect or orientations there are. Coronavirus does not identify with any of that. Couldn't care less whether you are the holiest of holiest people on the planet or whether you're the most evil on the planet. It's not going to um, choose a target based on any of these virtues or beliefs. So from that level, we have to be extremely realistic. There's going to be people on the planet that think they are invincible to it because they don't believe in the consensus reality. They don't believe in this, or they don't believe in that, or they never get sick, or God's going to save me. That's just, in my opinion, that's very unwise to be taking that approach. So it's got nothing to do with what you believe or don't believe. It's just got to do with the realistic uh, respiratory virus, because this is a respiratory virus, so it attacks the lungs, right? So, which is why elderly people are extremely vulnerable, and or people who have certain medical ailments or conditions and so forth. And the young children are the ones that seem to be less affected because they are usually the most healthiest, right? So these are important points, regardless of where this virus came from, whether it was purposely, created and thrown as a bomb into the world or not. Those are separate issues. And as I said, I'm not here to debate any of those because I don't really know. I really don't know. I have my personal sort of thoughts and opinions, but that doesn't really matter. I think it's just important to address here this Capricorn energy, how it can operate from a base of fear, which, as I said, can be very uh, helpful if it can just help you be more responsible with the things that you are doing in your life, especially at this time. Um, but if it's causing you to freeze and to fall into this deep psychological phobia and fear, and that's not going to help your well-being. That's not going to help your health. And I do respect and appreciate and recognize that there are a lot of countries that do not have the appropriate equipment or material that is needed, such as somebody pointed out to me, well, we don't have testing, facilities set up for us, and so on and so forth. You guys in Australia, you have it all there. That's what someone threw at me. And I respect that that is a truth. There are a lot of countries that there will be people in a lot more vulnerable situations because of the um, inaccessible, resources. I recognize that. But I suppose we all have to do what we can given our location and circumstances. We can't sort of, project this or get angry at this or get upset at that because we don't have this and they have that. That's not going to get anybody anywhere. So we need to just improvise and get our critical sort of thinking cap on and think about, well, what do we have around us and how can we best work with what we have? That's logic, right? That's what it's going to come down to. Now, in terms of testing and things like that, yes, we do have a lot of clinics set up here. I haven't gone to be tested, and I certainly don't intend to. That's my personal choice. Um, I am, however, taking very specific precautions, and I'm putting certain, very specific measurements in place for myself relative to protecting myself um, with regards to hygiene and so forth. I mean, I'm an incredibly hygienic person by nature anyway, but I, I go out to the gym, I go out to the supermarket, I go out to wherever. So I'm in a position where I'm interacting with outside forces from my private space. So I too am taking necessary precautions and not taking it for granted, thinking that, I'm healthy and Australia's got all these things set up, so I don't need to worry about it. I'm not unrealistic. So we all just have to work with whatever we have, with wherever we are. That's just a reality. And getting back to the astrology, this moon, as I said, it's going to heighten things up. Just be aware of that. Don't fall into the trap of um, just living in terror and fear. Just do whatever you can as best you can to put the appropriate precautions in place for you. Now, okay, so I want to move away from the virus thing. And I mean, look, just one final comment. We don't know when there's going to be a vaccine, made for it. There's theories around they're going to prolong it because, they want more people to die. There's all sorts of perceptions, theories, and ideas, and so on and so forth. And in truth, we don't really know. So again, even with that, whatever we believe, whether it's a conspiracy theory or whether it's a mainstream theory or whatever it may be, the fact is that we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when, a vaccine is going to be made. We don't know how many people are going to die. We don't know any of these things. And worrying about it is not going to help, right? So we just need to take it day at a time and do whatever we can to protect ourselves as best we can. It's basic, simple advice, but it's very wise. And I'm not saying that, I've got all the answers or what I'm saying is the be all and end all. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just simply speaking from my own personal perspective in a logical, basic sort of manner relative to what I'm actually doing as well. We've got to walk the walk, right? Not just talk the talk. Now, okay. So Saturn connects to the consensus reality rules and norms, as I said. It connects to dogma, restrictions, repression, oppression, depression. restrictions, old structures, old paradigms, patriarchal structure and nature of consciousness. And that just simply correlates to history. You know, for the last 6,000 years, we've been dominated by this patriarchal system, hence why everything is referred to the male gender, as in God, God's law, you know, things like that. So whether one believes that or not is irrelevant. It's just a historical fact. It's not my personal opinion. Why is that important right now to mention? It's important because we have Saturn ingressing into Aquarius, okay, which is going to, I think at this point in time particularly, actually I'd like to read a passage from Jeffrey Wolf Green's book, and this will encapsulate more or less what I was just about to say. So, and this is relative to Aquarius, Uranus, Saturn, you know, consensus reality, patriarchal existence, domination. It's also relative to the great astrological age, which is an age that goes for about 25,000 years. And we have been in the Piscean age the last couple of thousand years, hence Christianity, Christ, the symbol of the cross and Christ and so forth. And we are in a sub-Aquarian age at the moment. So these great cycles, they go for about 25,000 years. Now there's different schools of thought on when one started, when one finishes. I recognize that, and I'm not here to discuss that as a whole subject unto itself because that would take hours. But what I do want to say is, from my understanding, at the moment we are in the large cycle is still Pisces, right? Each large cycle goes for about 2,000 years or so. And then we have these sub-periods, right? So at the moment, and we have been in this for some time, and we are still not through it, we are in a Pisces sub-Aquarian age. And this is the reason why a lot of people think or believe or claim to know that we are stepping into the Aquarian age now. I don't think we are. I think what people are identifying and recognizing as the Aquarian age is the fact that we are in a sub-Aquarian age. But the largest cycle we are still in is Pisces. So the sub-Aquarian age is what's really defined and what really correlates to this technological age we live in, all right, and the absolute technological advancement over the last 20 years that we've seen grow and evolve, particularly over the last 10 years in such rapid ways. That's the Aquarian sub-age. That's what that is. That's why we have access to all this technological stuff that we do, and it's just growing rapidly on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so here's some comments from Jeffrey Wolf Green. As we move ever closer to the famed Aquarian age, new and different social structures and laws will necessarily evolve. The danger of the era that we are all currently share lies in extremism and in sectarian moral and religious philosophies that attempt to control, dominate, or suppress ideas or views that are different from the extremist agenda. The Uranian liberation of our times, collectively speaking, will involve the enlightened awareness that reflects the principle of unity in diversity, not the unity in sameness. As the age of Pisces mutates into the age of Aquarius, an opportunity exists to break free and liberate from history repeating itself. The human species is on the verge, once again, of radically altering its existence. We're all in the midst of another accelerated technological and scientific revolution that will ultimately impact on every aspect of individual and collective life. This impact will be more intense than the last industrial revolution. Now, Jeff wrote these words. It was quite some time ago. When was this? Well, this book was produced in 2014, but that doesn't mean that's when he said those words. I think I just get the sense it was earlier when he made those comments. I could be wrong, but I just get the feeling it was earlier. Anyway, the book says it came out in 2014. That's when it was published. So what I just read, I'm referring that to Saturn moving into Aquarius, for instance. So from a collective perspective, Saturn was in Aquarius 30 years ago, right? Now, 30 years ago, the internet didn't exist, did it? So we can see that 30 years later, when Saturn enters Aquarius again relative to historical points, from an evolutionary perspective, we have arrived in a technological age which is producing a lot of different things, a lot of things that are fantastic and a lot of things that are very, very harmful as well. That's one level. The other thing is that because of this technological age that is rapidly growing, this Saturn in Aquarius is going to take us through a journey of further radical shifts, we could say, and change that's going to take place on a collective level because of Saturn being in Aquarius. Now, traditionally, Saturn rules both Aquarius and Capricorn in traditional astrology. And as time has gone on, the association of Uranus has been made to the sign of Aquarius. And in EA, evolutionary astrology, it is without question that Uranus correlates to the sign of Aquarius. But I think, from my view at least, I think it's important to not just take Uranus over Saturn. I think we have to incorporate both Saturn and Uranus as rulers or correlating to the sign of Aquarius. Now, Saturn moving into Aquarius at this point in history is very significant because of where we've reached on an evolutionary level collectively, and also individually in our own evolutionary path and journey. Saturn in Aquarius is going to potentially, from an evolutionary level, it's going to seek to bring forth that part of us that is seeking to become more free, to individuate, to find a way to actualize your own identity in the world today, as the world looks and appears today. So the Saturn in Capricorn has been, whilst it's in, a position of rulership, as it's referred to in traditional astrology relative to essential dignities and abilities, it hasn't been a Saturn in Capricorn, at least from a collective perspective, that's necessarily produced wonderful things in the world, because the Saturn in Capricorn journey has been predominantly about this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which will end up being wonderful in time to come, in years to come, perhaps. But at the moment, it's probably very difficult to see that clearly. However, some people probably can. I certainly can, because it has been the deconstruction of a lot of old paradigms and systems relative to the patriarch. And, churches and organizations have come crashing down, governments, there's been a lot of exposure on the falseness of dogma and control and manipulation and lies and agendas that serve not the um, not humanity, as it were, but rather serve people who are in perhaps higher positions. So a lot of that has come crashing down in many different ways all around the world. And unfortunately, through that, there's been a lot of pain and suffering that's come through as well. That's the Saturn Pluto, because Saturn's going to resist the ultimate evolution and evolutionary impulse of Pluto. And Saturn's going to want to hold on for dear life to those old structures, because that's how it defines its reality. It is terrified of stepping into what may feel like a zone where he doesn't have control, right? Which is why control frequently correlates to Saturn, although it can correlate to Pluto and Scorpio as well. It's just a different way of exploring or understanding control through Pluto and Scorpio, but I won't get into that right now. And, even Rob Hand, who wrote this book about 30 years ago, his book, Planets in Transits, I just want to read you just a couple of lines of what he says about Saturn-Pluto conjunction, right? In terms of transit. Now, Saturn-Pluto is, as I've said before, it's a very challenging energy to work with, because it takes us to that place within us where we hold our deepest fears and insecurities, and where we absolutely have to grow and individuate and evolve Pluto. So the Pluto-Saturn conjunction has been very much about breaking down the walls of Saturn in your life. That is the Saturn part of your life where you are extremely conditioned. And conditioned means you can't see beyond that. You relate to the conditions that are in place in your psyche, in your life. And if we are to evolve and individuate, and individuation just means aligning with the most authentic part of your essential self. When we are conditioned, that's not who we are. That's not our essential self. The conditioned layers which inform what you believe, what you think, how you see the world, what you think you can and can't do, and so on and so forth. They are just conditions that have been imprinted in your mind relative to the environment you grew up in. It doesn't mean that something is true just because it was handed to you as a way of life, whether it's a thought, a belief, or whatever. So it is always our own responsibility to navigate our evolution and find our own truth. And Saturn doesn't allow us to do that. but Uranus does. So Uranus is always knocking on Saturn's door. Saturn and Uranus are the complete antithesis to one another. But Saturn is always knocking on the door of Uranus and trying to enable us to wake up, individuate, and evolve. And depending on where we are on our own evolutionary journey, will then depend on whether we answer the call to Uranus or whether we stay in the confines of Saturn. Now, here's what Robbie says about Pluto. Okay, although he's referring this to an individual person, we can also understand what he's saying in parts relative to the collective as well. So when I read this to you, it will sound like he is describing this for just one person, for an individual. But as I said, we can relate it to the collective as well. Okay, so it says during this transit, you may have fewer resources available for doing what you want, and you may have to focus the available resources on more restricted and concentrated objectives. Now, that line alone, you know, it's pretty powerful and pretty accurate just from the point of view of this outbreak of this virus, because the resources available are very limited, as I was just speaking about before, right? So here it is, Saturn, Pluto, resources become restricted because of Saturn's energy, right? Pluto is the power of transformation, while Saturn narrows and focuses. The effects of the combination are several. First, structure in your life will change significantly, but not suddenly or without warning. The changes brought about by Pluto are inherent in what is being changed, if you look carefully. It is rather like an inevitable conclusion of a situation. During this transit, some things will come to an end, or an old order of life will cease. This is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction relative to the comment I made before, breaking down the old structures that keep you limited and conditioned in your life. Then he says, on a metaphysical level, this transit means that factors are now being incorporated into the structure of your life that will later bring about evolution and growth. This process involves getting rid of old structures. What happens now will have great consequences in 14 years. On a material level, this transit often causes financial problems or other kinds of shortages. Now, again, we can relate this to the universal collective experience of this virus. There are shortages of freaking toilet paper. How ridiculous is that anyway? I still can't get my head around that, because what's toilet paper going to do for you if you are infected? So anyway, that's a side note, frustration of mine, because it just doesn't make any logical sense to me at all. However, there you go. This is you could say, the hysteria that's going on in the unconscious collective, right? People just, it's an unconscious collective reaction response to fear, right, of what's been injected out there. Okay. Sometimes government or other officials will impose heavy burdens that greatly restrict your freedom of movement. Boom, boom, there it is. So again, we can see these words are very clear relative to the current circumstances. Everyone's movement is restricted. That's a fact. It is also possible that some incident or accident may affect your health and thereby restrict your freedom and movement. Again, there's another important point, that correlates to what's going on, right? All these effects confine your energies so that later they can be focused upon matters that will require your full attention. If your energy is spread too thin, later crises will be much more difficult to bear. So, it's an important point there again, because it's alerting us to, from a collective perspective, to really be very careful with how we are using our energy and what we are investing our energy into. So he says, then you will have to go through a most unpleasant house clearing of everything in your life that interferes with your natural pattern of evolution. That was in conjunction with when he said if you're spreading your energy too thin, right? One danger of this transit is that Pluto can signify tremendous evolutionary energies which Saturn restricts, or he certainly tries to restrict. This can lead to an apparent suppression of the Pluto force. When the suppressed force erupts, it may be dangerous, explosive, and quite violent. As you are more and more restricted by circumstances and the need to use your own resources conservatively, do not simply hold in your energies. Build new structures to correct the problems you face now, and concentrate on all your energy on bringing about necessary evolution in your life. Saturn can give form to Pluto as well as repress it, and then it is much more fruitful. So we can apply that on an individual level and on a collective level relative to this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which is still active. It's still active, even though the technical conjunction passed, in that it occurred around about the 12th of January, I think it was. We still have, for the rest of January we had, and all of February, and now, 2 weeks into March, we still have that Saturn-Pluto energy there. And then we have the build-up following up with Mars and Jupiter. Now, so those of you that have 0 Aquarius ascendant, you're going to have transiting Saturn conjunct your ascendant. And that means you'll have Saturn in your first house for 2.5 years. Now, this is about to take place in a few days' time. And I have Aquarius ascendant, actually, and I will have, I have very early Aquarius ascendant, so Saturn will be on my ascendant, in a few days' time. I can't say I'm really excited about that necessarily, but it is what it is, and I will do my part with what I need to do, right? But for those on a general level, when Saturn comes over the ascendant, depending on your age as well, of course, and the circumstances and conditions in your life, Saturn over the ascendant can be a sense of finally being able to take control and responsibility over your own life. It can be that. It can be feeling more burdens about life and your responsibilities and duties. It can be identifying and recognizing new things about your own abilities that you never previously were able to see, or that you previously couldn't do. But fundamentally, it's about learning how to assimilate that Saturn energy in a way where you use it for its best qualities and attributes, which is being disciplined, being organized, structuring your life in a way that's healthy, and conducive to you and your lifestyle, and just taking things a little bit more seriously, perhaps. And Saturn over the ascendant can also mean losing weight. So if any of you have any weight issues, this can be a time where you can drop off weight. When you've got Jupiter going over the ascendant, it's a typical situation that you gain weight, right? But yeah, Saturn over the ascendant is a 2.5 year journey, more or less. Well, Saturn in the first house. So all you Aquarian ascendants are going to have a lot of work to do with yourself, your physical body, as it were, your own personal responsibility, your way of relating to other people, the ways in which you may start new projects in your life. It's going to be done from a Saturn level, which can be great if you're at a point where you're ready to really integrate some serious business, some serious discipline. Um, if however, if you're going through some difficult, hard times at the moment, the Saturn might be a burden. It might feel like a burden on your shoulders, literally. And Saturn does correlate to depression, so just watch that. Be aware of that. Because anybody that moves, as in any planetary body that moves over the first house, we literally embody it, we become it, we feel it. So we just, we just need to be aware of Saturn going over the ascendant in terms of what's going on in our life at this moment. So, and you might have an Aquarian sun or an Aquarian moon, or you might have Venus in Aquarius, Mars, Mercury. So all of you who have any of those inner planets and or the ascendant in the sign of Aquarius, Taurus, Leo, or Scorpio for the next 3 years are going to experience your life in much more restrictive terms. On the other hand, it is important to also recognize that just for Saturn in Aquarius alone, not necessarily aspecting any other planets, but just Saturn Aquarius alone, can really, at this point in time and history especially, can really help us unlock, if you like, activate, connect with that deeper, more essential, authentic part of our individuality, Aquarius, and to actualize that and give form to that through Saturn. So it's an interesting energy because Saturn is more comfortable in Capricorn, and has a greater resonance with the archetype of Capricorn than it does Aquarius. So the Aquarian, from the point of view of it being more of a Uranian type of energy, is that part in us that if you're a real rebel, as it were, and you sort of walk to the drum of your own beat, and you are an activist and things of that nature, you if you haven't worked through the Saturn level of things, in that being able to integrate it inside you so that it's not experienced as this projected consensus reality of what the world and everybody else and society and governments and whatever expect of you, then this is going to be a really challenging time with Saturn in Aquarius, because you're going to feel a greater sense of restriction and confinement in your own wanting of expressing your own individuality. So the key really is about integrating that Saturn, assimilating it into your consciousness and your life so that it's not projected out there, so that you use the Saturn in Aquarius in a way that just enables you to give greater form to the Aquarian component within you, because we all have Aquarius in our chart. You might not be a sun sign Aquarius or a moon sign Aquarius or whatever. We all have Aquarius in our chart. So the area that contains Aquarius is going to be significantly impacted by Saturn, over the next 2-3 years or 3 years. And it's also important to assess, well, what is the planet Uranus doing in your chart natally, because that can have a lot of clues to how you respond to this Saturn in Aquarius. Um, so Uranus, the 11th house, and Aquarius are the areas, you could say, that are going to be relatively activated, over the next 3 years while Saturn goes through the sign of Aquarius. But I really feel that there's going to be some really radical shifts that take place on an individual and on a collective level in ways that we haven't quite seen before. What they exactly will be, I don't know, because we haven't been at this point before in terms of where we stand now in history, in the times that we are in now. And certainly with it's the change that happens so rapidly relative to technology and relative to this virus thing that's going on. Things are moving very, very fast in certain ways. So we don't know exactly what's going to come. But if we think about it outside of those aspects for a moment, just relative to our own evolution, this can be a very empowering experience. Again, as I said, if we know how to work with that Saturn on an inner level, then if we go back to the little picture that I tried to draw in your minds at the beginning of this presentation, relative to the 7 chakras in the body and relative to the base chakra sitting at the bottom of your spine, where there is, and it's an energy center that contains 3 layers, which, as I said, the first was Pluto, then it was Uranus, and then it's Saturn. So think about it from that level. The Saturn transiting into Aquarius can be a real opportunity to have some breakthrough, right, of Uranus energy coming through, of the Aquarian archetype being opened up, if you like, or accelerated in our growth and our path of individuation, so that we can enable more of the Uranus frequency and energy, which is what essentially encapsulates our own uniqueness and individuality at its most pure essential level, right? And then beneath that, which is at the core and holding all of this together, is Pluto. So Saturn in Aquarius can stimulate this energy for us if we are working consciously on our path with these sorts of teachings or paradigms or understandings or insights. So yeah, it just depends who you are, where you're at, and what's going on in your life relative to what this Saturn in Aquarius. I mean, yeah, again, it can be extreme restriction for some Saturn as Sun in Aquarius people. It could be a time where you really activate that Aquarius archetype, allowing the Uranus frequency to come through as well, relative to the chakras that I was talking about, therefore enabling more evolution to step up, come forth, accelerate, however you want to frame it. So obviously there's going to be general statements and correlations pertaining to the archetypes, which will speak on a collective level and on an individual level. But then the most important thing that comes into it is our own sense of consciousness, understanding, evolution, growth, and development, relative actually to any transit or any cycle or any archetype for that matter. So I think that this can be a very interesting time over the next 3 years. And the other thing to also keep in mind is that, see, Saturn's only going to be in Aquarius for about 3 months this year, because once it goes into Aquarius on the 22nd of March, which is interesting because that's literally, you know, a day after the equinox, right? The sun ingressing into Aries, which is that within itself is a new birth, a new cycle being born relative to the sun's movement, and that has spiritual implications as well. So there's something very core and central being born with the sun moving into Aries and then Saturn moving into Aquarius. So that marks a very important juncture and opening for us all, right? But in July the 1st, Saturn will go retrograde back into the sign of Capricorn and will not come back into Aquarius until December the 18th of 2020. So Saturn is kind of, this year especially, first of all, it's giving us like a little prelude of a little snapshot of what the Saturn in Aquarius will mean collectively and what it can mean for us individually. It's just like a little taster, right? And then at the end of the year, when Saturn goes back into Aquarius, the journey sort of kicks in a different way then. So we're getting a little teaser, you know, just for a few months, 3 months. And this is also the Saturn in Aquarius, that is, over the next 3 years, is really preparing us for what's going to be born when Pluto enters the sign of Aquarius, which is, I think, is going to be beyond what we conceive, beyond our comprehension, beyond what we can see. It's going to be really hardcore, futuristic, out there stuff that we can't even imagine at the moment. And naturally, as that time becomes closer to us, I will discuss that, you know, down the track at some point. But I think we don't need to rush ahead, and especially at the moment with everything we are dealing with, it's just important to be very, very present and just as much as we can be aligned with the higher self and the higher truths. And that is not to say that what is happening in the world at the moment is not truth, because it actually is, relative to this experience of duality and this experience on this 3D reality, right, on this earth plane. It is a truth and a reality that we are all a part of, we are all subject to in some kind of way, and we all have to deal with it. And if we don't find ways to unite in our thinking, our acting, and our projecting, I don't think we're going to go through this ride in any easy way. Not that it's an easy ride, but I mean, you know, the more divided we become, the more tension, crisis, and chaos emerges. But again, you know, I guess we can only do what we can from our own personal standpoint and position. But it is important to share and to connect with those that are like-minded, communities, individuals, whoever it may be, and hopefully inspire and encourage others as well. Because if we don't do that, then we fall into the trap of falling into the sheep, sorry to say, but yeah, the sheep mentality, consensus reality, perceptions, and so forth. That's not to deny the truth of what's happening, but it is to recognize that um, it is challenges like this that really call on us to, and that test us to walk the walk of what we sort of discuss or preach or share, or want others to believe or know or hear or understand. So in amongst the chaos, we must still try and nurture the peace, because that way we lead by example, right? And that's incredibly important, isn't it? Um, for our own sanity, for the sanity of the collective, and just for our own evolution and growth. So that's my take. In summary, mind you, what we are currently experiencing and facing and dealing with, and some ideas around what's potentially going to unfold over the next 3 years. But it is without question that we are living in really significant times, um, on every single level. And whilst the crisis appears to be harmful and devastating and painful, it is also part of the bigger picture of things to come that our left brain doesn't have the capacity to see or understand, especially at the moment. So I'll leave it there, and I thank you for listening. And yeah, please feel free to leave questions and comments below. And as always, I'll do my best to respond. I hope that you're all keeping safe and doing well in your own journey relative to your overall journey in life, actually, and more specifically to the events of what we're being faced with, you know, as a whole. So yeah, just sending you all much love and blessings, and look after yourselves. And I will see you guys very soon with more. Thank you, and bye for now.